Bonjour, bienvenue pour cette...
So welcome to this session entitled Democratizing a More Accessible Culture. We have Béatrice Desgranges, President and CEO founder of Mars Attack. Marie-Cécile Zinzou, President of the Zinzou Foundation for Contemporary Art and Promotion of Culture in Benin. We'll have with us Paul Hermelin, President of Capgemini and President of the Board of the Opera Festival in Aix-en-Provence. Christophe Leribot, President of the Orsay and L'Orangerie Museum. We have Amos Gitaï, architect and filmmaker. So Nathalie Moreau will introduce the topic. Nathalie Moreau is an economist at the Paul Valéry University of Montpellier, specializing in culture economics. Thanks a lot, Cheyenne. By way of introduction, allow me to thank the Cercle des Économistes for dedicating a panel discussion on culture, and culture can be on a par with the environment, finance, most of the time, culture is the cherry on the cake, but it is not being discussed enough. But culture is a way of having a critical look at the world, and of course culture will reinforce the bonds. Remember, during the lockdown, lots of people started to sing from their windows. People reproduced works of art. It was quite a significant movement in order to enlighten the daily lives of people. And of course, there were lots of artists who were instrumental in this movement. When you look at the figures regarding the cultural practices, the situation is not really positive. Lots of cultural practices have gained ground, especially on music. The Ministry of Culture since 1973 has conducted some surveys on cultural practices, and for music in 1973, only 9% of people aged between 15 and more declared listening to music on a daily basis. The figure today is 57%. So it's a widespread practice, a democratic practice. Of course, you have to consider digital technologies. They contributed to the democratization. If you look at the movies industry, the cinema industry, despite the development of the digital technologies, people like to go to cinema theaters. 50% of French people have declared that they went to a cinema theater. So you could say that 50%, that's quite high. But 40% of French people didn't go to the cinema. And even though it's a kind of democratic practice that is widespread, for other cultural practices and patterns, the figures are not as rosy. Look at exhibitions and museums. Only 30% of French people who declared that they visited a museum or an exhibition, so it means that 70% of French people didn't attend an exhibition. And all cultural practices are connected with tourism. For classic music, the figures are even lower. Only 6% of French people declared that they went to a classic music event, and 80% of French people said that they've never attended an opera. So when you look at these cultural practices, they are connected with entertainment, and heritage-based practices or contemporary works might be less successful. And for the artists, they can question our world, and how can we make sure that heritage-based practice concern everybody. We have a right panel of experts. They will be talking about their different cultural practices, and they will try to diversify their audience. Océane. So, Béatrice Desgranges, you are the president and co-founder of Mars Attack, targeting young people, and this is an ideal for many cultural organizations, democratization of culture, what it's all about, and how does it materialize for Mars Attack. So, just to tell you that the Mars Attack Festival is a festival in Marseille dedicated to electronic aesthetics. You have hip-hop, techno music. It's been in existence for the past 25 years with 45,000 spectators, and it is held at the Parc Borelli, or Borelli Park, with a lot of heritage. So, it's a very aesthetic approach geared towards cultural democratization. Regarding democratization of culture, there are 4 drivers that we need to pull. First, programming. How do we make sure that we can arouse the interest of young people? How do we make sure that they will attend and participate in those festivals? We are keeping abreast of the current music trends or musical trends. We've paid heed to the program, the artists that we produce, and we want to make sure that we want to have leading artists together with emerging artists. So, it's important to highlight artistic emergence, and this has to do with democratization. So when we target a young audience with hip-hop, today we'll be talking about digital tools. Hip-hop is the kind of music that is being the most listened to between 18 and 25 years of age. So for these events, it's not really difficult to attract this audience. The second driver is economic. You have to take into account prices. The price of the cultural activity will determine the choice of people. And you need to consider that with inflation, it's much more difficult. But for current musics, for hip-hop festivals, the artists want to pocket in. So with live events, these artists can get a lot of their revenues, so there are lots of festivals. So you have to pay the price if you want to see those artists. And then you have to take into account inflationary pressures. So the pricing strategy should be as affordable as possible, as accessible as possible. So at Mars Attack, we have prices 30 euros for 3 days, so 10 euros for 1 day. So we target students, people aged between 18 and 25 years of age, and they don't have a high purchasing power. There's a third driver to consider and to pull. Awareness raising of artistic activities. We have a program called Mars Attack School. So we launch some artistic creative projects, and we fetch artists in high schools, junior high schools, and they will heighten the awareness of young people so that they can prepare a work of art. We fetched artists who will support them when it comes to producing an unprecedented work of art, and then they will play on the stage of the festival. So this has to do with the development of the individuals, and we're quite optimistic because we can shape the mindsets of the spectators of the future. There's another driver when we talk about cultural diversity. Of course, we want to have a program that is diverse, international, very diversified. It's important to highlight the different forms of cultural expressions, but we want to make sure that we have a large audience as diversified as possible. And this year, we zero in on accessibility to disabled people. In our festivals, we want to make sure that any individual can be welcome and any individual can take part in a show, in a festival. We want to have a democratic approach. The objective is to attract a large audience as wide as possible. These are the 4 points that I wanted to underscore by way of introduction. Marie-Cécile Zinzou, democratization of culture within your organization. What is your take on that? What does it mean? I have a different experience. I grew up in France and could get access to everything, opera, museum, dancing, so I could get access to cultural events, and it was free of charge. And it has been the case when I was at school as part of my personal life, and I decided to go to Benin, and in 2005 I opened a contemporary art museum. Why? Because a museum is a driver for the intellectual construction of young people. And young people, when they only get access to school, they feel powerless. In Benin, the culture is quite rich, there is no doubt about that, but there was no access to a culture. So democratization of culture was very rich, was fruitful. 100 years ago, there are lots of things that were unknown, but after the post-colonial era, the traces of these cultures vanished into thin air. So you had the French colonial heritage and the French culture that was taught at schools, accessible through schools, and the disappearance of our own arts and histories. So the idea behind this foundation was to create a contemporary art museum. So for many people, it was a mistake because it was not a priority in East African countries 18 years ago. So how can we talk to the audience? How can you explain the audience? How can we explain to the audience what is our roles? So you open a foundation, but people will say, what is your role? Why a museum? In Cotonou, the economic capital of museum, there was no structure of this kind. There were 6 structures during the colonial period, dusty structures, and they are being renovated 64 years after colonization. So the question was, in West African countries, will people go to museum and understand the whole process? So we celebrated 3 weeks ago our 18th birthday or anniversary, and we received millions of visitors. So you can get an insight into the enthusiasm. It's part of human nature in Bolivia, in France, in Africa. Parents know that for the construction of the minds of young people, it's important to go to museums. So we decided to make a choice, art, contemporary art. So we decided to talk about the creation of a continent, the creation of a time. Who are we? What does shape us after years of slavery, years of colonization? Who we are? What about this new identity? We are younger countries. We will turn 63. but with lots of traditions that have disappeared. So who we are today? There's something that is of interest. People don't know that there's a tradition of a culture democratization in the Dahomey Kingdom, one of the key kingdoms shaping Benin, the Ruetanu, and it's an important element. How can we show the whole population from the 18th century, the national collections, the king collections, the kingly connections? So the king will bring together the whole population, and for 3 or 4 days there are different festivals, different celebrations. You have the show of wealth, you have all of the treasures are being exhibited, the treasures and the artifacts of the court, of the king court, are being exhibited. But if there is no enthusiasm, some artifacts will be given to other people, and the next year there are some artifacts that are popular, and then they will be re-exhibited the following year. So this is art dating from the 18th and 19th century. So in fact, this movement is deeply rooted into our culture. So when you open a museum, the first day there were 6 people who heard about the opening of the museum. One person was 7 years of age, and he said it was great because we were telling stories. And then he came back the following day with the whole classroom. At the end of the day, 700 classmates. And we called the schools and we told them that we need to establish a partnership. It's very difficult, to manage 700 children who would be interested in the works of Deola Zomé. So their parents, they've realized that it was interesting to visit the museums thanks to their children. And then the museum was free of charge. So price is a question. And of course, we are not talking about the entrance. The entrance is free of charge, but mediation is should be free of charge. You need to talk the same language as people. So I've introduced you to an artist, so it's up to you to reciprocate. But at that time, Facebook, YouTube, did not exist. Transportation expenses were free of charge. And remember that the minimum wage was 50 euros. When you have to pay for €1 in order to go to the museum, it's very expensive, 1/10 of the family budget. And there were some cultural practices that did not exist in schools. And it was possible for young people to be immersed in the artistic creative movement. And that's why cultural activities were free of charge. Paul Hermelin, you are working in the field of opera, lyric art. Is lyric art democratized? I will cheat a bit. It's like the teachers of the pupils of the teacher. Most of the time, I will go to generative AI and ChatGPT. This is what young people do. We don't have too many young people in the room, but young people, they will turn to ChatGPT and generative AI. So how can we democratize access to culture? I asked ChatGPT. First, education, to highlight cultural and artistic education by taking into account music, dancing classes or courses within the curriculum. Second, subsidies and funding, to increase the public subsidies for organizations. Media libraries should be modernized with a large selection of books, digital books and digital artifacts. Then online access, to develop digital platforms. 5, to cooperate with communities. The community should be involved in the programming, transport and affordability. 7, awareness raising and communication. So ChatGPT is not really stupid when you have a look at that. I will make a personal effort. So what strikes me, if you visited opera is the most expensive, but this is the king of the arts, but it is quite expensive. It's important, I mean, to have some money. If you consider the artists, I mean, the price they're asking to feature is very high. And you have productions at Aix-en-Provence. 36% of the seats are offered to young people with reduced prices, 30 euros for a seat. They will spend 30 euros to go to a Kanye West concert.
Well, it's much more expensive to go and see Kanye West. It's much more expensive than 30 euros, 120 because I went to the concert myself in Bercy in Paris. So opera is tricky. We do stuff, we do all kinds of things. We have agreements with 74 schools in our region here in France. We have trained 3,500 school children in opera. There was a whole program there. All year round, our festival has pedagogical activities in the region. And I want to raise one point. 1 week after those incidents that ensued the death of young Naël, we've got the 14 to 18-year-old. We want to get the 14 to 18-year-olds interested in culture. And you know, as I do, that this generation is a generation TikTok, the zapping generation. Their attention span is very short and has to be constantly refreshed. So an opera which lasts 3.5 hours. Last night we had Così fan tutti in our opera. The first time, people find it too long, and the first time that the curtain closes in between acts, people kind of sneak out because it's just too long. So I think if we want to get culture, people blossoming towards culture, then we have to look at this creating new works. I think we teach children about literature. We need to teach them how to make proper photos, good photos for Instagram. We should teach them how to make short films to put on TikTok, because this is the way the youngsters express themselves. It's no longer describing a play in five acts as Molière and Corneille and Shakespeare used to do. So we need to educate children about creation. That's just my obsession. You've got this planetary challenge, a challenge that all of the youngsters are taking on board, which is the generation. The challenge of their generation is the planetary challenge. And behind this issue, we've got militants who believe they're doing the right thing. They're saying we must stop consuming. Yes, we do consume too much, and we consume throwaway things. And if we want to stop consuming, that means that individuals are going to have to be able to stand out in a different way. People don't want to blend into the crowd. They want to have their personalities recognized. So today I will go to Instagram, and I'll place a photo of an apple in a destination where people want to go. Because what people do nowadays are organizing Instagram journeys. More people die by taking an Instagram photo than in a terrorism attack. There are 378 people who died because they wanted to take a fancy photo of the last 3 years. That's more people who have died at the hands of terrorists. So people want to stand out from the crowd. So let's enable them to do that by them being artistic. We have to really review our school programs so that people learn how to express the individuals who they are, so that they can be recognized through their creative talents. That's what we're trying to do in Aix with our festival. We want to boost people with these Mediterranean instruments, for example, and operatic works. We want to push them out of their comfort zone, get them into hip-hop, electronic music, video games, the metaverse, creation, creativity. Christophe Leribaud, president of the museums, the Orsay and the Orangerie museums. So what have you got to say on this, and how can you implement the democratization of culture? Well, not only according to ChatGPT, we need to get as many people enjoying culture as possible. A real challenge for the museums is to decode images. And as we've heard, we will take a lot of pictures. We're surrounded by pictures. We're not always talented in the pictures that we take. It really is important to have places such as museums to understand. There are three fronts. There's the territorial aspect, to have museums, monuments that are available. There's a strong network in France and in Europe. You need to have these economic opportunities also. And here again, for the Orsay Museum, 40% of our visitors come in for free. There's the first Sunday of every month. We have evenings for the youngsters at €10. Youngsters don't pay before they reach the age of 25. If you come with a child as your hostage, the two parents will have a reduced entry price. So we are finding ways of improving that. The second barrier, the second frontier, is psychological. How can we get rid of that barrier? And how can we inspire people to want to come in through the door of a museum? For the Orsay Museum, we have a place which has been built to be very easily accessible. It's in the lobby. The Orsay Museum is at the Orsay station, and it's in connection with the Louvre. All paintings from a certain period are in our museum. All sculptures and paintings from a specific period in time. And so we don't really have a problem filling our museum. There's 3.5 million visitors a year, 1.2 at the Orangerie Museum, which is a smaller wing. The important thing for us is not only to be a tourist attraction. Yes, of course. When I'm a tourist and I'm abroad, I love to go to the Grandet Museum here in Aix, for example. But the French youngsters of all age, we want them all to come into our museums and feel at home, to learn. We want it to be pleasant and interesting for them. And that is the real challenge. Fortunately enough, this is one of the effects of COVID, possibly. Instead of, as in the past, having 70% of foreign visitors, we now have 49% of French visitors. So after COVID, the French realized that they missed going to the museum. And so we're doing everything we can to generate the loyalty of these French visitors. So they return to our museums time and time again. And to do that, we have to have good communication to all different segments, but we also have to have a varied schedule of shows. We've got the Cultural Olympics, for example. There are going to be urban sporting events just next door to our museums, and we've used this pitch to have all kinds of innovations. We've got breakdance, we've got hip-hop. And the goal here is to have a common cultural foundation shared by us all. Another lesson we learned from COVID was that in our statistics, over 82% of our visitors come as a family. So there are individual visits. It used to be 35% before COVID, but that has gone down since COVID. So a museum is a place where you go to share with others. You discuss. You can get in a conversation with people around you. So it's a place where you can meet people. So it's no longer segmented. If you look at the social networks, you sit at home in front of your computer or your phone, or you're watching Netflix. But now, you know, we might be going to the cinema a bit more. So the museum is an excursion. It's a trip. You go out, and when you're talking about an excursion, that means you go out, you're immersed, and it's encouraging us to look deeper into our scheduled events that we're organising. Amos Gitaï, you're a filmmaker. What is your take on this question of democratization of culture?
Okay with you? It's okay? Good. I actually want to go to two words which are in the summary of the discussion, which is culture and democracy. Because does culture have any impact on democracy or not? Okay, we are in a tsunami because everybody was speaking about institutional impact, the way of diffusion and so on. but the planet is in a dramatic situation of the recul of democracy everywhere. I mean, in my own country, in Israel, we see what is happening in France. We don't know what will happen. We see a neighboring country, Italy is already fascist. We'll see what will happen in Spain. Finland is turning to the extreme right, so we'll see what will happen in the US. Not talking about Ukraine, Russia, and all of that. So does culture have any impact on democracy? Do we think in these terms about what is okay, all these wonderful museums, France has fantastic museum, Quai d'Orsay is a beautiful museum, bravo, and all these civic institutions, but what is about the way of life? I mean, you are right that the opera is not a principal activity, but what is how can culture have a civic contribution, you know, without being demagogic, indoctrinary. Unfortunately, we know that not much. Let's look at a very famous painting like Guernica of Picasso, you know. So Picasso is shocked by the bombardment of the Luftwaffe on the Guernica, on a Basque village. And what is his medium? He's a painter, so he's making a painting. Still, Franco won the war. He remained in power for many years, and he did not change the route. And so culture, even from the, let's say, African civilizations, was a way of healing. It was a kind of a guérisseur, the role of the artist, if we take it to the origin. And culture today is becoming a market, so we are very happy with all the statistics that was presented this morning. But does it have a real impact on the shape of the society, on keeping people desiring to have an open society, liberal values, respecting the others, and so on? And I think that we have to admit that in this sense, it is a colossal disaster. And so this is, I think, the real question. What is the impact of civic engagement? And there are several models. There is obviously the New Deal of Roosevelt, when the state sent photographers, artists, playwrights to all sorts of corners of the country to communicate also with popular populations, not just the elite. And I think these are the questions that I think that in this emergency moment, not so comfortable in spite of all the achievements, statistics, etc., we have to rethink in a radical way what is the place of culture to promote and to, like you say, to provoke rethinking about the place of culture. Thank you.
Une notion qui traverse.
Yes, one notion which we've heard time and time again is to create for the common good. And if we come back to social networks, do you get the feeling that culture has been fragmented, what with digital tools and the different digital uses? Or do you think there's been a massification of culture in your eyes? And what is the impact of either of those two trends? Who would like to come back on that? I think the digital tools have contributed greatly to rendering artists really famous. Because youngsters today, when they're on the social network, and I come back to what Paul Hermelin said earlier on, yes, they are an Instagram culture. Yes, they do let everyone know where they are, showing others that they're experiencing something absolutely breathtaking. But unlike what has already been said, this is not a solitary practice. You're not on your own behind your computer. No, you're putting it into a network. This is an experience, coming to a festival, coming to a museum. You physically go to the museum, and you often don't go on your own. You go to share experiences with those around you. And then you want to share with the world the experience that you've just had. So in this generation, social networks go beyond communication. Social networks are a way of practicing culture, of engaging in culture, because they can make comments, they can reveal where they are, they can relay information, and that notion of recommendations is so very important. And these are tools that are permitting this democratization or this massification, if you like. Paul? Your question is very tricky. There's a question of the uniformization of culture, and there's also that fragmentation on the other side. So we've got a globalized world which is becoming more uniform, and gradually young French people have got engaged in rap music, and they have a lot of imagination compared to the American rappers. But here, the different musical forms are giving kind of a uniformity in different. So we had seen the commercial music world was making everything uniform, but now we're trying to find some differences. Is it a problem, this globalization of musical forms? The previous person at the head of the festival in opera said that there are these recording studios were very small. There are these studios where you can learn how to do sampling, where you can learn to do DJing with the two turntables and do your scratching and stuff. And to take an example of, I'm not sure about Cotonou, but there was an exhibition which struck me. It was called The Magicians of the Earth. It was a long time ago, 40 years ago or 30 years ago. And it taught us that creating a picture in Africa is not in the form of a painting that you'd hang up and frame it and put it on your wall. No, it could be on a tarpaulin on a truck. These artists were expressing their talents, their imagination, their creativity in these competitions that truck drivers were in to have the most attractive truck in the area. So there's always been adaptation and fragmentation. Human genius is like that. I was talking about Kanye West. He wanted to do an opera, and you can see it on opera. It's called Nabucco Dinosaur. And so the theme was Mesopotamia. And it's not the best opera in the world, let me be frank with you. But it was amazing to see how he would comply with all of the codes. When Kanye West started to look at opera, he became very uncreative. Paul McCartney has written oratoria for Liverpool. You can spend 10 minutes listening to it. He's not being very creative there either, because they are geniuses. Paul McCartney, the Beatles were geniuses, of course, but when they approach opera, for example, they are impressed by it. They kind of bow down before it, and they're curtsying far too low before it. I think creation today is not going to be in hip-hop or things like that today. We need new waves of creativity. Yeah, I'd like to add one thing. Social networks can limit your concentration span, but is this perhaps a direct descendant of the television and the radio, for example, whereas the TV have always been to exhibitions and shown people what it's like, but that's never prevented people to actually physically go. But is this not a straight line with the social networks? And given that, and I'm going to talk about Cotonou here, depending on the context, such as that of Cotonou, where there is a cultural offering which is kind of restricted to private initiatives, which can't cover everything, does that not open a window on the rest of the world? So social networks enable you to see the entire world and to all types of creativity. It can be inspirational, the same way that the radio used to do that. I've got a friend who was a tenor from the Congo and sang at Bastille Opera House. He grew up at Lubumbashi. There, that part of the world, you have no chance of ever being an opera singer, because there are no common denominators between where he grew up and the opera. But he heard someone on the radio singing opera. And so once he'd heard that on the radio, he said, that's what I want to do. And he started to sing, and he could imitate exactly what he had heard on the radio. And he worked hard. And then because of all of the miraculous encounters he made, one day he was on the Bastille Opera stage and he could sing there. And what does he do now? He wants to he's sharing that on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook. And there are children back home where he comes from who are listening to him, and he today comes with musicians and instrumentalists, and he is bringing the opera, taking the opera to Umbashi, which was impossible at the time, and it's only possible thanks to Instagram.
And Instagram turns out to be a window on the world. It's an opening process available to everybody, and data is very cheap. So this is the place to be, and everybody will be on an equal footing regarding culture. Christophe Leribaud, the Ninfair at the Orangerie Museum are very successful on social networks. So what do you think of that? Of course, we are using all kinds of means. We are on social networks, we communicate, we share, we arouse envy. So museums used online practices. Our collections were put online. Some concerts were broadcast online. But it's a matter of structure, of defining a framework. People will end up on a site with thousands of conferences, concerts, specific programs for children in all languages. But of course, the process should be accessible, affordable, and understandable, so you can be lost at the Vatican, but you can also be lost on internet sites. We need to target the right people. We want people to rummage through the creative processes, but we want people to liaise with the works of art. We want to share the works of art as part of a common passion. Amos Gitai, what about that? What do you think? Or maybe questions from the audience? What would you say? Any questions that you would like to put to the speakers? There are some online questions.
Pour commencer avec les questions qui nous ont été... Ah, pardon, monsieur.
Là, il y avait une question. Ah oui. Bah, allez-y.
Bonjour.
I posted a question on the site. I'm Jacques Chilumot. I'm in charge of the Philharmonics of Provence Méditerranée. I'm a conductor. Following what has been said, allow me to chip in. The different speakers on stage are aware of sharing culture to make sure that people feel like going to a concert, going to an opera, going to the theater. And Mr. Hermelin talked about Così fan tutte. If young people attend Così fan tutte, when the curtain drops, they will leave. It's true, but it's not always true. It depends on the work that is being done upstream. So, ChatGPT, you've described ChatGPT in a very relevant way. You talked about public funding as well at the X Festival. The festival is largely subsidized, but the structure that I manage is poorly subsidized, and some structures might disappear. I conducted the Festival of Aix-en-Provence, but now it's not possible for some people to go to an opera without paying. But today, you have small structures. How can they continue to make a living? I'm here And I think that we need to work with companies. Education is a pivotal. Education is a driving force. If young children have to draw, if they want to play music, they will be interested in representations, cultural representations at the stadium. I listened to the Général of the Orchestra of Paris, and I listened to the Oiseaux de Feu conducted by McKelly. So how can we make sure that everybody is aware of what is going on? Something that you mentioned, 80% of people don't go to opera, only 7% of people will go to a concert. How can we reverse the trend with the corporate world? Of course, you have sponsorship. There, you can have concerts, exhibitions within the corporate world. Companies can take part in that process. They can cooperate. There's something to be done. I don't want to dampen your enthusiasm. I know that you want to do a good job, but if nothing happens, some structures will disappear. And we are supported by the Aix-Marseille metropolis, but will it last? But we have less support. We have some social projects with kids, and we are putting all the stops to make sure that the culture becomes a common good. But subsidies have been on the wane, and they will disappear. Over time, many structures won't be able to operate. So we need to take that into account. I mean, all the elements that I've described to you. So 2 questions: how can we protect these small structures, and what is the role of the corporate world when it comes to promoting culture? Many things have been said, but we are not going to tell the state. You can't blame the state, and we managed to get a 7% rise in the budget. But if you have a look at inflation, budgets are being curtailed. So the state is still committed to culture. But of course, you have fees, artist fees that have skyrocketed. So you raised a disquieting question. Passion for CSR means that companies are moving away from culture in order to focus on planet-related issues and social issues. So it's very difficult to get a corporate philanthropy for cultural activities, except if they have an educational connotation. Of course, people want to take up the challenge of a planet. So corporate philanthropy is moving away from cultural institutions. So what is important is to focus on innovation, because there's a social dimension. So with CSR, you have the word social, but I've noticed that corporations and companies have moved away from cultural philanthropy. So people were made familiar with Wozzeck. It's not an easy opera, an opera of the 20th century. So you need 1 year to study this opera. So it means that young people should be trained for 1 year in order to understand the opera. There was another question. Yes, good morning. I come from Nice. I work in an association in a neighborhood of a city. I'm with high school students. In terms of success at school, people should be open to culture. I'm quite happy with this session. We are advised to help and support people with the contemporary tools. Of course, you've talked about hip-hop, but what about the challenges of humanity regarding the opera? So getting people to the opera, that's a good thing, but if they have to attend a 3-hour opera, it's not possible. But as part of the city policy, there are young people who are ambitious. They work well in junior high schools, in high schools, but they've never set foot in an opera. It's an experience that I witnessed 2 months ago. But you need to ask young people, they want to become architects. And if we help them, they will be able to attend and enjoy a 3-hour opera. It's not a question, just a comment on the role of the corporate world. I'm the chairman of ENGIE, and ENGIE has been cooperating with the MUSEM for 1 year. Though the digital impact is low, but with the MUSEM, there's a coach that will fetch young people in the northern districts, and they will be able to attend some cultural events. And of course, it's a tailor-made process. I'm the president of the Opera Board of Paris, so there's something that has struck me. Have a look at the opera sponsors. We have Chanel, Rolex. You have Patrick, the leader in recycling. Patrick is a significant sponsor. It's a family-controlled company, and from one generation to another, we managed to perpetuate the commitment. Customers, employees can attend those cultural events. Very enlightened. The Paris Opera, that seems to be elitist. So they will head for Guyana with the support with Meridiam, managed by Thierry Deo. We'll be spending 1 week with our artists. So we'll go to Guyana, a faraway country. We will show them what is dancing, what is opera, what is lyric art. Of course, this does bear witness to a living endeavor. We want to make sure that people can get access to culture. This is something that is pivotal. So it speaks volumes. The commitments of corporate bosses are key. Lots of initiatives were launched by companies when Marseille-Provence was the European capital of culture. In the long term, it's difficult. It requires a lot of energy. It depends on the commitment of the corporate leader when it comes to mobilizing the teams, being open to artistic creation. That's why there are some stumbling blocks. So it's not easy to promote culture, especially from the corporate world. So the partners, the sponsors have a key role to play when it comes to promoting our cultural activities. Just an observation. So I've witnessed the situation in France. I admire what the French state does. In West Africa, we haven't any subsidies. It's impossible to get some funding for culture, so I cannot be with my colleagues in theaters, in operas. There is no financial commitment whatsoever. There's a new law that has been enacted in order to get a tax-free rate. So what is happening in France is exceptional. So you are quite fortunate. And from Benin, I admire France because culture is right and not a luxury. So I will give the floor to Nathalie. I will summarize the debates. So regarding culture, culture is synonymous with enjoyment, pleasure. And with culture, we can have a critical look at society. Amos Guitaï has talked about the importance of culture at a time when democracies are being challenged. Having a critical look means that we need to look at ChatGPT. So with culture, we can embody values. So we talked about ChatGPT, the definition of ChatGPT. Cultural embodiment is important. The role of education is key in Africa. Some bonds were forged with schools. There are potent links with education. The issue of pricing is key. The use of social networks is important. Social networks should be a tool, and they shouldn't prevail over culture. And what about the founding model of culture? It was not supposed to be a topic of this panel discussion. When you talk about culture, you need to talk about culture founding, the role of a state. What do we finance? As Amos Guitaï said, if the public authorities decide to finance culture, what about the cultural assets? Who will be managing them? There are some cultural practices that are more important to finance, but which ones? But I think that these topics should be given